Welcome to Power Lunch, the podcast from the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, where you can get smarter while eating your peanut butter and jelly sandwich over lunch. I'm your host, Aaron Clems, Director of Public Engagement here at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Power Lunch is a conversation with one of our experts recorded live. We live stream this conversation on Facebook Live, which is what you're watching right now, and also make them available to you as an audio podcast. And in each episode, we focus on one aspect of MCEA's work to defend Minnesota's water, climate, air, and people. MCEA has been doing this work since 1974, and our lawyers, policy experts, legislative lobbyists, and mapping and GIS specialists give us a unique capacity to protect the Minnesota that you love. Today, we're talking to Kara Josephson. Kara is MCEA's legislative director. She leads our legislative team at the Capitol. And after working as a staffer for the State and Local Government Committee for several years at the Minnesota Senate, Kara came to MCEA in fall of 2018, and this was her first session as MCEA's primary lobbyist. So we hope you learned something today that you didn't know about our work at the Minnesota Capitol. If you want to keep up with our work, please visit our website, www.mncenter.org, or follow us on Twitter and Facebook at MCEA 1974. That's at MCEA 1974. If you'd like to support our work, please consider a donation and just go to mncenter.org/donate. And now, our Power Lunch conversation with Kara Josephson. So, Kara, welcome to Power Lunch.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're great. We're very happy to have you here. So tell me about your job at MCEA. What is your job?
Sure. So I'm the legislative director at MCEA. So I'm, the primarily responsible for advocating and advancing our legislative work at the Capitol. I work with our program directors at MCEA, water program director, energy and climate program director, and shaping legislation, and then, really working on the ground during legislative session to help advance, our proactive bills, but then also keep an eye on some defensive work that we need to do, too, to protect our environmental laws here in Minnesota.
Yeah, and we'll get into some really good specifics about what happened both in the kind of offensive realm of trying to get new and better policy, but also stopping some bad changes as well in a little bit. How did you get involved in legislative work in the first place?
Sure. Well, I've always actually really had an interest in politics and the legislature. My undergraduate degree was in political science. As soon as I graduated from college, I got an internship at the legislature and worked there for several years. I started out as a committee page, became a legislative assistant, then a committee administrator for the State and Local Government Committee. And that is really where I think I developed a really strong interest in lobbying and helping to advance legislation, just kind of seeing things on the other side. And I really wanted, after spending several years there, I wanted to use my expertise and the legislative experience that I had and then help, organizations and environmental nonprofits in particular help advance their goals and really protect our environment, because I think it is threatened and we need a lot of people at the Capitol to help stop some of the bad laws that are proposed.
Yeah, so you just said a minute ago that you got interested in doing lobbying work, but the word lobbyist is kind of a dirty word for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So what do you think the biggest misconception is that people have when they hear that you're a lobbyist or what a lobbyist does?
Sure. Well, it's funny that you ask, because a lot of times when people ask me what I do say that I work for an environmental nonprofit instead of a lobbyist, which both are true, but that is kind of one of the first answers that I give. Yeah. And a lot of that is, I think people just have a negative conception of lobbyists, and they think that, they're really all about profit. And I think, that there's some mistrust in relationships between lobbyists and legislators and kind of things like that. But Minnesota has actually really strict policies and laws in place to protect corruption and things like that. I mean, there's a gift ban. Lobbyists are prohibited from giving legislators a gift over $5. So I think there are a lot of protections in place in Minnesota. So, and then, working for an environmental nonprofit, you're usually outnumbered by some of the big lobbyists. So I think the traditional view of a lobbyist is not really what we do here.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. So how does the work that you do as a lobbyist differ from some of your colleagues that are working for, industry or for the Chamber of Commerce? Like how does the way that MCEA and the way that you do lobbying differ from the way that they do it?
Sure. Of course, our similarities in our approaches, but I
Sure.
think probably the biggest difference is that we're really outnumbered, and a lot of that really does have to do with funding. And I think a lot of the industry lobbyists, they're well funded. They're better funded than we are, and they have a lot more lobbyists on the ground at the Capitol. They're able to hire big high profile law firms to help them. So I think there are definitely differences there. And as working for environmental nonprofits, a lot of times too, you're representing the people and not necessarily the industry or the corporations that do have more money. So.
Right. So how do you keep from being overwhelmed then? I mean, like it's, I think that the Chamber of Commerce has something like over 20 lobbyists, and, Xcel Energy, the largest utility in the state, might have more than 20 lobbyists on the ground.
Yes.
And these are some of the folks you go up against. So how do you keep from just being overwhelmed by the money and numbers of industry?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest ways that I do that, or that we do that as an organization at MCEA, is to partner with other similarly situated organizations. We've got some great coalitions, and we work with a lot of other environmental organizations and broader beyond environmental organizations too. When we have an issue or a topic that we have a shared policy position on, we a lot of times work together, and I think there's strength in numbers, and we can be more powerful in that way.
Right. That's a good point. So let's pivot a little bit and start thinking about what actually happened, because I think one of the craziest things about the end of this legislative session was that we had this little mini special session, but it kind of felt like everybody thought the thing was over, but it wasn't. It was kind of like the end of one of the Lord of the Rings movies or something, where it should have ended 3 times and then actually did finally come to an end. But I think there's a lot of folks who just, because of that, we never really had a chance to take a step back and say what happened here and what worked and what didn't. So what was the biggest win at the Capitol this session for the environment?
I think one of the biggest wins actually happened very early on in session, and it was the passage of House File 80, which was the bill that fixed the unconstitutional rate of lottery funds that dedicated to environmental projects that was rated actually in the previous session in the 2018 bonding bill. And this House File 80 fixed that and restored the funding to the way that it should be.
So let's go back a little bit and think about that, what happened in 2018. So if I recall correctly, this happened right at the end of the session. There was a bonding bill, and there was some changes that were made at the very last moment before anyone had a chance to really look at them more carefully. What got jammed into that bonding bill at the last minute?
Sure. So, you're right. It was the final hours of the 2018 legislative session. And I think what happened, I think there are some legislators who just don't really appreciate the Environmental Trust Fund, and we're using the fund as a new avenue to really raid bonding projects and use it for bonding in unconstitutional ways. And so what happened in the final hours, when the 2018 legislative session, the bonding bill was being passed, they raided an estimated $164 million from the fund, and it was really to pay the principal and interest on state bonding projects. And I should note that this had never been done in 30 years of the trust fund. So this was a novel, new approach, and a lot of environmental and conservation organizations and others too were very concerned that this new way of funding is unconstitutional use of funds and could set a precedent for future raids.
So this Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund might be a term that's unfamiliar to folks. Where does that money come from?
Sure. It comes from lottery proceeds. And this was actually, the voters voted this and approved this back in 2008 as a constitutional amendment. So this is something that the Minnesota voters approved. Okay.
So the lottery commercials that we're seeing now on the television that says like this was brought to you by $1 billion from lottery proceeds. That's the money we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, and this goes back to 1988, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So there's all this money in this pot. How do they usually spend it?
Well, there's it's called the Clean Water Fund and the
Well, these are legacy funds. So we're talking about like the lottery funds.
Sorry.
So no, that's okay. There's so many. This is one of those areas where there's so many acronyms. It gets really confusing.
So there is a citizen-led commission called the LCCMR. It's the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources, and that is a citizen-led commission. So appointed, there are no. Sorry.
All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And they go through a process. They hear hundreds of proposals from various organizations, agencies who all want to have are coming out with proposals to protect our environment. Very wonderful projects on the ground that can help various different areas. And they go through a pretty rigorous process. The commission meets several times throughout the year. They have hours, day-long hearings. They hear from all the different projects. And then once they thoroughly vet the projects, they come up with a set of recommendations, and they send those on to the legislature. And then the legislature approves those the recommended projects. And this year was kind of unique because the Senate actually was trying in their bill, their environment bill, they were really deviated from a lot of the citizen-led recommendations. So that was kind of an interesting.
So basically, like both last year and then again this year, there were efforts that were done to try to go around the recommendations of this Citizen Commission and to insert some different ways of spending that money.
Yes.
And that wasn't constitutional because it was this bonding approach where they would take it and basically say, for the next 20 years, you have to pay the interest on this bond. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then there's also the constitutionality issue, of supplementing versus supplanting. And that was part of the lawsuit that we filed. And so
this is about the question of whether or not this money is new extra money. Because when voters approved this fund, they wanted it to be used to add to the work that we're doing to protect the environment, not just replace other existing sources of money.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. So the upshot of all that now is that this money remains in the fund and is available to be spent on projects. Can you give me some examples of some of the projects that might get funded now or that did get funded because we defended that fund with both a lawsuit and some of the legislative work that we did? Yeah, I mean, there's at least the one that you worked on when you were in your previous job too, right?
Yes, yes. There's one project to bring kids up to the Boundary Waters that may otherwise not have the opportunity to do so. There are a lot of really good research projects at the U of M that are being funded. A lot of local governments too that are getting needed.
There's a lot of the kind of stuff that is desperately needed, but are the kinds of priorities that don't easily get funded.
Yes,
and that's why they come to the LCCMR, the Legislative Citizen Commission, to try to get funding for them.
Yes,
right on. So we successfully. So this is kind of a cool story, I think, that to end with, at least to say that the Governor Walz had the first bill that he signed was this bill.
Yes. Yeah. And I do think that our the lawsuit, I should add that, so we filed a lawsuit on behalf of several environmental and conservation organizations, and MCEA was the attorney for those groups. And I do think that helped put pressure on the legislators and on the governor to do that fix early on in session.
So this is a good example of where the ability to use the tool of the legal tools that we have at MCEA combined with our ability to work at the legislature work together to try to achieve an outcome then.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a really cool win to start the session. Let's go to the end then, and I'll just kind of ask it this way. Like, what was the end result? Was this a win for the environment? Was it a loss for the environment, or was it a draw?
Sure. I say it was a draw. I mean, there was a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, legislation to roll back our environmental laws that was pushed by the businesses and industry that we helped to stop, and that did not become law. But on the flip side, there were a lot of really, wonderful pieces of legislation in the energy realm, for example, that did not become law. So really, at the end of the day, so much got tied up into the budget negotiations, and really with a divided government, not a lot got done. I mean, they finished with the special session and did complete the budget, but beyond that, it really wasn't a whole lot of significance that got done. So I would say it's a draw, especially for the environment.
And there was a lot of emphasis early on in the session there was a lot of hearings in the House Climate and Energy Committee looking at the impact of climate change and the needed policy changes that need to be undertaken in order to address this climate crisis. What So you're saying there wasn't much progress, if any progress, made on energy and climate issues?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, there was a lot, as you mentioned, a lot of energy from people. I mean, a lot of people showed up. There were hours of testimony in committees, hearings. And I have heard from several legislators, actually, that climate change and climate issues were one of the top issues that they heard the most about this session. But unfortunately, again, because of the divided government and because of, largely, honestly, the Senate, they really put up a roadblock to passing some legislation that, the House was pushing and the governor. For example, 100% renewable energy standard by 2050. A lot of there's a Green New Deal that was introduced late in session. A lot of really proactive policies.
So what are the prospects for those things coming back? I mean, are these ideas dead now, or are we going to hear more about climate and energy issues at the Capitol in 2020?
Oh, I would imagine it's going to be a top issue that legislators are going to be hearing a lot about. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I mean, the makeup is still going to be the same. There's still going to be the same committee chairs, same leadership. So I don't know, especially on the Senate side, really what is going to change between now and next legislative session. And then also, the reality is that it's going to be it's an election year too. So I'm sure a lot of legislators will have that top on their mind, but at the same time, they really legislators respond to their constituents. So I think the more that legislators can hear directly from their constituents on the importance of that issue, that can help.
Right. So there were also some really bad ideas that got killed at the Capitol this year. What were some of the worst ideas that were in play during the end of the session negotiations? Because I know that you were up there practically 24/7 in the last couple of weeks, just trying to keep an eye on some of these bad ideas and making sure they didn't become law. So what were some of the worst ideas that were put forward?
Sure. Yeah, there were a number of them. And as I mentioned earlier, largely pushed by the industry. And for example, some of these that were we had been around in previous sessions too. One was to give industrial polluters up to 16 years to meet stronger water quality standards. 16 years is a long time. Another one was requiring a social permit to adopt new water quality standards.
What's the social permit?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting one. So that would basically give veto authority to one county. So all 87 counties must approve adoption of stronger water quality standards, which seems
Well, when was the last time all
difficult.
87 county boards in Minnesota did anything together?
I'm not sure if that has ever happened before. I don't know.
So this was basically just an attempt to make it so that you could never adopt a stronger water quality standard.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And we saw, there were other similar. Basically, it was just a desire to loosen our environmental laws and protections that we have here, and that's what a lot of these that we saw. Yeah. Another one that was kind of interesting too was that it would allow the sale of state mineral leases for brines and non-fuel gases, and that was added on as an amendment very late in the process, and it didn't receive a hearing in the appropriate policy committee. So we raised that kind of as a procedural issue, and that I think, luckily none of the policy provisions I just mentioned were passed into law.
So they were pulled out. So there was this process that happened at the end where there's a conference committee and they were making offers back and forth. These were never agreed to by both sides then.
Exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I should mention it was the Senate that was pushing most of these, and then the House was kind of fighting back against them. So a lot of this session all came back to the divided government that we had.
Yeah. On the flip side, besides bad ideas that didn't become law, there were also good ideas that didn't become law either. Mm-hmm. Right. So what were some of the good ideas that we saw that either the MCEA worked to try to get passed or tried to support that didn't happen this year but might come back next year?
Yeah. Well, I think one really wonderful bill that would be great to put back into law, and that would really give a lot more power to citizens, would be to reestablish the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Citizen Board. It was actually removed a few years ago, and I think just now we're really seeing a need for it. And we tried, we were one of many groups that asked for it to be reinstated this session. It did not. I think next session, that's something that, we would like to push again, because it really gives an opportunity for citizens to provide more of an oversight role to the MPCA. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, just this Sunday, of course, there was an editorial in the Star Tribune that called for investigation of some of the MPCA's actions around the polymet permit. Mm-hmm. And in previous years, before the MPCA Citizens Board was repealed, you would have had to have gotten that permit approved by this group of citizens before it could be issued, right? Mm-hmm. So this might have changed the game.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of, where the MPCA Citizens Board could be very useful. And yes, so I definitely see that coming back, or hopefully coming back the next section.
With even more reasons to do it. Yeah.
Yes.
So besides the MPCA Citizens Board, what else are good ideas that should be reconsidered in 2020?
Yes. Well, I mentioned this before, but I think it's really important given, everything that we're seeing in the news and hearing about with climate change and how we need to take action and time is running out. Mm-hmm. And Governor Walz and the House proposed this, 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. That seems like that's an easy step. Other states are doing it. There's clearly the momentum and energy there from the people here. I mean, there was a 100% rally at the Capitol towards the end of session. Hundreds of people showed up. I mean, the will is there, the need is there. We just really need to get the Senate to come around on that.
Right on. There was one other item that I thought was really interesting that didn't become law, but it looked like it was going to, which was a ban on a chemical called trichloroethylene, and it was a subject of an air pollution case in White Bear Lake, but it's been a problem in Minnesota's groundwater, particularly for many, many years, many decades actually. Mm-hmm. What happened with that? What happened that this bill? It sounded like this was going to pass, and then all of a sudden it didn't.
Yes, and actually there was. Initially, there was bipartisan support for it. Members, from both bodies, both sides of the aisle supported this. There was a very active group of citizens from White Bear Lake who live near the affected area, and they were at the Capitol lobbying. I mean, everything looked like, this was into the very end of session, and it looked like it was going to pass. And then during those negotiations that you mentioned that happened at the very end, where there was back and forth between the chairs and majority leaders, most of which was happening behind closed doors mm-hmm. and at late hours, that TC ban bill and got dropped, and it was not included. And we later learned that the reason for that was pressure from the Chamber of Commerce, which is the industry. So
this raises another more broad question, because there was this phenomena at the end of the session where you had, they talked about the cone of silence, and they did the negotiation about the shape of the budget between mm-hmm. Governor Walz, Speaker Hortman, and Majority Leader Gazelka, the three main players in this budget negotiation. But after that was over, they basically gave this back to all these committee chairs, and then they negotiated behind closed doors for these policy provisions that got included. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of talk early in the session about negotiating in public and having conference committees where everything was happening in public testimony. Mm-hmm. Did we make any progress this session on opening up this process, or is it just getting more closed and more behind closed doors?
Early on, there were a lot of committee hearings and there was a lot of public testimony. So that did happen. But when the actual decisions were being made at the end of the session, a lot of it was behind closed doors. So I really don't think much has changed. I don't know if it's necessarily gotten worse, but I think, it really seemed the same. So I think, to the extent that citizens can continue to contact their legislators and ask for a little bit more transparency, I think that might be helpful. And I know Senator Marty has a bill to reform some of that too.
Yeah. I think a lot of folks don't understand that the Capitol, there's no open meetings law that applies at the Capitol.
Exactly.
It applies to every other unit of government in the state of Minnesota, but not the Minnesota legislature.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's why it's important sometimes at the very end of session, that last weekend when they're there at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, to just just be there. Just show up and be there.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what MCEA does, is we're that group of people that are there at 10 o'clock at night on Friday to make sure that these things don't get slipped into bills, and then we find out 2 weeks later what actually happened.
Exactly.
It's not easy work, but it's something that's absolutely essential. What can we look forward to in 2020? I mean, what are the kind of the general shape of the next session? Because I know 2019 is a budget year, and so it tends to take up all the oxygen in the room. But what happens in 2020, and how will that change the way we think about this session?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, this session being a budget year, pretty much everything was tied up in the budget negotiations, and it all depended on that. And they were, became policies that shouldn't have been involved with the budget became part of the bargaining chips that were traded. And so this coming session, it's a bonding year. So we're not going to see that, hopefully, as much. So the focus will hopefully be on a bonding bill, a strong bonding bill, and also policy. So I think that allows more room for independent policy to move forward and not get tied up with the budget negotiations. But as I mentioned earlier, one thing to keep in mind, it is an election year. So everyone will be up for re-election in 2020. So that will be likely on the top of legislators' minds and will dictate, a lot of the decisions that they make.
So they'll see a lot of people trying to make the other side, quote unquote, take bad votes.
Yes.
Right? Where they think that they can take advantage of that for the election.
Yes.
Yeah.
A positive, though, is that they may be more receptive to their constituents,
Right.
and be especially sensitive to what they want. So the more that constituents can contact their legislators about environment and climate issues, I think that will be helpful.
Yeah. So you mentioned a moment ago that maybe there'll be some more space for policy bills to kind of get traction in next year's legislature because there's not as much emphasis on the budget. And MCEA worked with legislators to introduce 2 different bills this session that didn't get hearings, but we think both represent pretty good ideas. Can you talk a little bit about the bills that MCEA worked with legislators to get introduced last session?
Sure, yes. So one, we had 2 bills. One was to kind of a novel approach to address source water and increase source water protection for individual well owners. There were 2 parts to the bill. One would have provided reimbursement to well owners who have high levels of pollution in their wells, like, for example, nitrates. And there are several, especially in southern Minnesota, there's some alarmingly high levels of nitrate in drinking water. And so our idea was to use an already existing fund that gets its fees from pesticides and fertilizer fees, and to use that fund to mitigate these well owners who are looking to upgrade their wells in order to have safe drinking water. The second part was just a clean water fund appropriation to MDH, it's the Minnesota Department of Health, for well mitigation. So we're really focusing with that bill on private well owners and just making sure that they have a way to have safe drinking water.
And so there's a new rule that's just coming into effect very soon that addresses some of the issues around nitrogen and nitrate in wells. But that, to my understanding, that doesn't affect private well owners at all, right?
No, it does not. It's just for public well owners.
So this would have been an attempt to get some resources to people whose wells were polluted so they could have clean drinking water.
Yes.
And this bill didn't get a hearing then, is that right?
It did not, no.
Okay.
No. So
it sounds like such a good idea.
It is, yes. Yes, but
how much does it cost to drill a new well or to put in treatment systems for
thousands of dollars, upwards of $10,000. It's expensive.
And right now this would fall just entirely on the person who owns that well and who's trying to provide drinking water for their family.
Exactly. Yes. And I should say some of the pushback was from the fee that we were looking at to get the funds from, and so this the board of that fund, I think they're very protective of it, and there were some concerns there. So there's, I guess, still some more work to do, although it is a great idea. Yeah. And we had legislator support behind it. So definitely work to be more work to do.
Who is the chief author of that in the House?
Representative Lippert.
Okay, so he's from Northfield, right?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the affected areas that has high levels of arsenic and nitrate in their drinking wells.
There was a second bill that got introduced late in the session as well that got a little bit more press, too.
Yes. Yeah, so that was a 21st century mining bill, and it was modeled after legislation, very similar legislation that passed in Montana that was actually led by the mining industry and supported by the mining industry in Montana. And essentially it just adds, updates the standards to add kind of an extra layer of protection for the mine tailings dams in particular. And it requires independent oversight, independent engineers to review, and just add some extra protections in place.
And so you said this is a bill that was passed in Montana?
Yes, which is bipartisan, largely Republican actually, state. And yes, it passed with support, and it was led by the mining industry.
When you say it was led by the mining industry, what does that mean? Like, did they write the bill?
They were the ones who really were pushing the bill in the state. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So
it's a very, very moderate approach to a bill. In fact, so moderate that I think some environmental groups may not support it because they won't think that it goes far enough.
Well, right, and from what I've read about this bill, it sounded like that in Montana it kind of got. I got a thumbs up from the environmental groups, but it was kind of a half-hearted thumbs up.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It does some good things, but it doesn't address the whole problem in a way that's comprehensive enough.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I assume then that this bill was welcomed with open arms by the industry here because it was written by the industry in Montana, and that Republicans here in Minnesota were enthusiastic about it because it was passed by a Republican legislature in Montana. Is that true?
Oh, I wish it was.
Oh, come on.
I wish it was. That's kind of what we were thinking. I mean, we really were intentionally, coming up with this very moderate approach because we know how politically sensitive the issue of copper nickel mining is here in our state. Yeah. And so we thought that this would be a good way to, address some of the issues around the safety concerns of the tailings dam, but also maybe just kind of a small step going forward. And no, we were met with resistance. It was very difficult, actually, to even find a willing chief author in the House. It was, unfortunate we did not get a hearing. In fact, it was so difficult to find authors on the bill that we introduced it fairly late in session. So,
but ultimately, there were a set of people who put their name to this bill and are working hard for it, too.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
In the House, who's the author that is moving this bill forward?
Yep, Representative Steve Sandell, and he represents the Woodbury area.
Okay. And the Senate, which is controlled, as you know, by Republicans, it really helps to have a Republican author, and I believe there is a Republican author of that bill, right?
Yep, Senator Paul Anderson. Mm-hmm.
And
so it's a bipartisan. We have a bipartisan bill, and we did have very good, productive conversations with a lot of legislators, and some who we may not have otherwise spoken to. So that was really positive, and just I think to get legislators thinking about tailings dams and the safety concerns around it and ways that they can help address it, and that's something that this bill provides.
Yeah. So for those folks who don't know, I mean, the way Minnesota does legislative work is kind of on a 2-year cycle as opposed to a 1-year cycle. We like to talk about this session as if it's a single year. Mm-hmm. So what happens with these bills now? They've been introduced late in the session. They haven't gotten a hearing. Did they have to start from scratch or?
No.
No.
No. Good news. No. So the bill, the way the legislature works, operates on a biennium. So the first legislative session of each biennium, which we talked about, which was this last year, was a budget year. And then the second legislative session of the biennium is a bonding year. And so that we're coming up into the second year of the biennium. So all of the bills introduced are still there. We will start day one on the legislative session with all the bills from last session. So, if the desire is there, legislators could schedule a hearing on day one of the bill.
So there's been 3,000 bills in each the House and the Senate.
Yes.
And all of them are still alive, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even mostly dead. They're totally alive.
Yes, they're alive, and it is not a budget year, so there could be several policy committee bills that get passed this session.
But as you said earlier, the makeup of the legislature hasn't changed.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the things that were getting in the way of moving these bills forward then will still be in place.
Yes, they will. Yep.
Okay. So it's early. I know we're still kind of, I think the next session begins in February of 2020. Mm-hmm. So we're still more than 6 months away. Mm-hmm. So you're just taking a few months off then, right? You're just chilling. You're not going to do any. You're taking a long vacation.
No, there's always work to be done.
Okay.
I mean, we've done a lot of kind of recapping of what happened this past session and, talking to our supporters and other groups and kind of doing a lot of that work. But we're already looking towards next session, starting to have meetings, with different legislators, different coalition groups, really trying, and agency staff as well, and trying to figure out, develop our policy priorities, also seeing what other folks are working on and ways that we can partner with them and, work together going forward for next session, kind of be strategic. And we've already been meeting with some legislators too, so.
Great. So for the folks out there who are not necessarily deeply involved in this, but want to learn more and stay involved, what are some of the ways that they can stay involved, know what MCEA is working on, and make sure that they have the information that they need to talk to their legislators when issues that they care about come up?
Sure. Well, first of all, sign up for a legislative update. That's number one. You can find that on our website. We send out weekly legislative update. And so definitely do that. Also, if you go to the Secretary of State or legislature's homepage and just type, find my legislator, you can type in your address and you can find out who your representative is and who your senator is. And that's something I would encourage everyone to go do. Find out who they are, contact them, share with them the issues you care about. That is very important.
Well, I mean, I just want to, before we conclude, I just want to go back to what you just said, which is, I think one of the challenges of working at the legislature, especially for folks who are just everyday people who just care about the way the environment is treated at the Capitol, they think they can't make a difference, or that their voice doesn't matter, or that no one will listen to them anyway. But you're saying that you think it really does make a difference.
It does. Yes. Having worked at the legislature, I mean, I used to work for senators, and I directly witnessed them respond to constituents and saw how, sometimes number of responses, too, from constituents dictated and helped shaped how they voted on certain issues.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really critical to hear that and to understand that part of your job as an informed citizen who cares about these issues is to make yourself not only aware of what's going on, which we'll help do, that's what MCEA will do for you, but that you can also take the next step and then reach out to your legislator. And even if it's as general as I care about climate and I want to make sure that I have a livable climate for my grandchildren, that's a message that matters.
Exactly.
And it might get them to take an action that otherwise they wouldn't take.
Absolutely. You don't have to be an expert on the issue. The legislators are not expecting that. They have people they can turn to. They just want to hear directly from you and what you care about.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Kara. We really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, of course.
So 2019 was a really important year at the Capitol, and it's shaping up to be a big year in the courts as well. We have 7 court cases currently working through the system right now on Polymet. We're working on other issues involving climate change, making sure that there is good renewable transmission lines available to move wind power and solar power to market. And all these decisions will be made in the context of an election, as Kara was saying, in 2020. These will still affect our climate, our drinking water. And the real question is, will we start taking the bold actions that are needed to protect our water, to protect our climate, and make sure that we're leaving a livable, healthy environment for our children and grandchildren? And that's what this work is designed to do. And as we said, you have a stake in these important decisions and a say in these decisions as well. So please feel free and please take advantage of MCEA's resources to help you be able to do that work yourself. First of all, our website, www.mncenter.org, has links to a lot of resources that are available about our program work, current actions that are happening. And the most up-to-date information is, of course, on social media. So we are on Twitter and Facebook, and we both have our handle at MCEA 1974. That's MCEA 1974. As Kara mentioned, we do a weekly email update during the legislative session. We're past that right now, but if you sign up now, you'll be on the list as soon as we get started again. And we will put out any updates that are relevant during the time between these sessions. You can sign up either at our website at the legislature, or you can go to a short link, bit.ly/MCEA legislative update. That's bit.ly/MCEA legislative update. If you're listening to us live on Facebook Live, welcome. And also know that you can meet us in person just this week. So on Thursday, June 27, 2019, we're having MCEA's Happy Hour Open House where you can talk to policy experts like Cara. You can talk to our lawyers who are working on the PolyMet litigation right now. You can learn more about our work on a one-on-one basis with our experts while enjoying a beverage and some nibbles from Birchwood Cafe. You are welcome to join us. It's easy to register online at our website, mncenter.org, so please go there and let us know you're coming so we can make sure that we have enough food and drink for everybody. Lastly, we can't do this work without you. If you want to help our work defending Minnesota's environmental legislature, please consider a contribution to MCEA. Go to www.mncenter.org/donate. That's mncenter.org/donate. This has been MCEA's Power Lunch with Cara Josephson. Thanks for listening. This is Aaron Clem signing off, and we hope you'll share your lunchtime again with us soon. Have a great day.